The paper was still warm from her hand when I unfolded it, and by the third line my own hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down on my porch steps in the dark, because what my neighbor had written wasn't a thank you note for the burgers. It was a confession that would unravel everything I thought I knew about the quiet house next door, and about the woman who had lived in it alone for 11 years. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe kindness can find its way back to the person who gave it, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one are exactly why we're here. Now let's go back to the beginning. My name is Daniel Voss, and 2 years ago I moved into a small house on Larchmont Lane in a town I'd chosen mostly because it was cheap and far away from the life I used to have. I was 34, freshly divorced, and carrying around a kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. My ex-wife had left with our daughter Mia, who was 6, and moved 3 states away to be near her own family. I got her every other weekend, a handful of holidays, and a lot of silence in between. I told myself I was fine. I told myself a lot of things. The house next to mine belonged to a woman named Eleanor Chase. She was somewhere in her late 50s, silver-haired, always dressed like she was about to attend a meeting even when she was just watering her tomatoes. For the first year I lived there, we exchanged nothing more than nods over the fence. She kept her blinds closed most of the time. Her mail sometimes piled up for days before she collected it. I noticed these things the way you notice weather, passively, without much thought, until one day the pattern breaks and you realize you'd been watching all along. It was my daughter who broke the ice between us, the way children always seem to do. Mia was visiting for a weekend in early spring, and she'd kicked her soccer ball over Eleanor's fence. Instead of ringing the bell, I climbed over to grab it myself, embarrassed, expecting an annoyed look through the window. Instead, I found Eleanor already outside, kneeling in her garden, and she handed the ball back to me with a small, tired smile and said only, "She has a good kick." That was it. 4 words. But something about the way she said them, gently, like she was remembering something, stuck with me longer than it should have. After that, small things started happening. She'd wave when I got the mail. Once she left a jar of her homemade peach preserves on my doorstep with no note, just a little ribbon tied around the lid. When Mia visited again in the summer, Eleanor came out and asked if she liked lemonade, and then spent 20 minutes teaching my daughter how to skip stones across the shallow drainage ditch behind our houses, laughing in a way I hadn't heard from her before. I remember standing at my window watching them, feeling something in my chest loosen just slightly, like a knot finally getting some slack. But Eleanor herself remained mostly a mystery. I noticed she flinched at loud noises, especially around the 4th of July. I noticed she never had visitors, not even during the holidays when every other house on the block filled up with cars in the driveway and voices spilling out into the yard. I noticed that sometimes late at night her kitchen light stayed on until 2 or 3 in the morning, and I wondered, in the selfish way of someone drowning in his own problems, what kept a woman like that awake. It was late June when I decided to throw a small backyard barbecue. Nothing fancy, a few neighbors, some burgers, a cooler of drinks, string lights I'd bought on sale and never used. Mia was staying with me that week, and she'd been the one to suggest it, saying she wanted to see Miss Eleanor again. I invited a handful of people from the street, but if I'm honest, the only person I actually hoped would come was Eleanor. She showed up a little late, wearing a cardigan despite the June heat, carrying a store-bought potato salad she apologized for twice, as if homemade was some standard she felt she'd failed to meet. She sat mostly on the edge of things that evening, at the far end of the picnic table, watching the other neighbors with a kind of careful distance, like someone standing at the shoreline deciding whether the water was safe. But she came alive around Mia. My daughter dragged her by the hand to see the fireflies starting to blink near the fence line, and for a moment, in the fading light, Eleanor's face lost 20 years of whatever weight it had been carrying. Near the end of the night, after most of the guests had gone home and the string lights were the only thing left glowing in the yard, Eleanor lingered by the gate while I was folding up chairs. She thanked me for inviting her, said it had been a long time since she'd had an evening like that. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, the kind torn from a notepad, edges a little uneven. She pressed it into my hand before I could ask what it was. Her cheeks flushed pink, not from the heat, and she said quietly that this stays between us. And then she turned and walked back to her house without waiting for a response, without giving me the chance to ask a single question. I stood there in my backyard holding that folded paper for a long moment before I opened it, half expecting some kind of joke, or maybe just a recipe, or a thank you note dressed up as something more mysterious than it was. But when I unfolded it under the porch light, the handwriting was small and careful, like she'd rewritten it several times before deciding this version was the one she could bear to give away. The note explained that 11 years earlier, Eleanor had a son. His name was Peter. He would have been around my age now if he'd lived. He died of a drug overdose at 23, alone in an apartment 2 states away, and Eleanor hadn't found out for 4 days because they hadn't spoken in almost a year before that. The note said that in the months after his funeral, she'd sold the house she and her late husband had raised him in because she couldn't stand walking past his old bedroom, and she'd moved here to Larchmont Lane, to a street where nobody knew her, where nobody would ask about the son they assumed she simply didn't have. She wrote that in 11 years, she had let almost no one close enough to know any of this, that she had built a version of herself that was polite and distant and safe, because safe people don't lose anyone else. And then the note said something that hit me harder than anything else that night. She wrote that watching me with Mia this summer, watching how hard I tried even on the days I looked exhausted, reminded her of the version of herself she used to be before grief hollowed her out. The mother who used to skip stones and pack lunches and believe that trying was enough. She wrote that she was sorry to unload this on a near stranger, that she almost didn't hand it to me at all, but that some nights the weight of carrying it alone for over a decade had become unbearable, and something about my kindness that evening had made her feel, for the first time in years, like maybe she didn't have to carry it entirely by herself anymore. She asked that I not mention it to her directly unless she brought it up first. She asked that this stay between us. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on my porch steps rereading that note until the ink practically blurred from my thumb pressing over the folds. I thought about my own daughter 3 states away and how easily distance and silence can calcify into something that looks like normal life but is actually just avoidance wearing a mask. I thought about how many mornings I'd nodded at Eleanor over that fence without once wondering what kind of ghosts lived behind her closed blinds. The next few weeks I didn't bring it up because she'd asked me not to, and because I understood in a way I hadn't before that trust like that isn't something you get to spend all at once. But I changed how I showed up. I started leaving a little more time in my evenings to talk to her over the fence, not forcing anything, just being present in the way you'd want someone to be present with you. I asked her, one afternoon in July, if she'd want to come along when I took Mia to the county fair, framing it as needing an extra pair of hands, though we both understood it was really an invitation to keep being part of something instead of watching it from a careful distance. She said yes, and at the fair, watching her laugh at Mia winning a stuffed rabbit at the ring toss, watching her hold my daughter's hand as they walked toward the Ferris wheel, I saw something shift in her posture, something looser, something that looked almost like relief. It was in August, nearly 2 months after the barbecue, that Eleanor brought up the note herself, unprompted, on an evening when we were sitting on my porch after Mia had gone to bed. She told me more about Peter this time, not just the ending, but the boy he'd been before the addiction took hold. The kid who used to build elaborate blanket forts in their living room and swore he'd be an architect one day. She told me about the years of trying to reach him during his addiction, the boundaries she'd set that she still, a decade later, wasn't sure were the right ones, and the guilt that had settled into her bones and never fully left. She cried a little that night, the kind of crying that comes from a place someone has kept locked for a very long time. And I didn't try to fix it or rush her through it. I just stayed and listened and let her know that whatever she needed to say, there was room for it here. Something changed after that night. Slowly, the way seasons change rather than the way weather does. Eleanor started leaving her blinds open more. She started coming to the fence not just to wave but to talk. Real conversations about small things. A book she was reading. A recipe she wanted to try. Whether Mia might like to help her plant bulbs in the fall. She joined a grief support group 2 towns over. Something she told me she'd been too afraid to try for years because it would mean admitting out loud to strangers that Peter had existed and that losing him had broken something in her that she was still trying to piece back together. And I found myself changing too, in ways I hadn't expected. Being trusted with someone else's deepest wound made me braver about my own. I called my ex-wife and asked, without defensiveness for the first time in over a year, if we could find a better rhythm for co-parenting, one that gave me a more consistency instead of the fractured version we'd been living. I started therapy myself, something I'd resisted since the divorce, telling myself I didn't have the kind of problems that warranted it. Watching Eleanor find the courage to open a door she'd kept locked for 11 years made my own locked doors feel less permanent, less like fate and more like something I was choosing. By the following spring, the house next door didn't feel like a mystery anymore. Eleanor kept a small photo of Peter on her mantle now, something she told me she hadn't been able to do since the funeral because looking at his face used to feel like drowning. Now, she said, it felt more like remembering someone she was allowed to have loved. She and Mia planted a small garden bed together that spring, and Eleanor named one corner of it after Peter, a patch of sunflowers, because, she said, he used to love how tall they grew, taller than him, taller than anyone, reaching for something none of the rest of us could quite see. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it's made you think about a neighbor you've never really spoken to, or a person in your life who might be carrying something heavier than they let on, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. These stories only reach the people who need them when you help pass them along. Before we close this out, I want you to do one thing for me. In the comments below, I want you to write the name of someone, a neighbor, a friend, a relative, who you think might be carrying a quiet grief you never fully asked about. You don't have to explain the whole story. Just write their name, or their relationship to you, as a small promise to yourself that you'll check in on them this week. Eleanor Chase never fully stopped grieving her son, and I don't think grief like that is something a person is supposed to stop carrying, but she stopped carrying it alone. And it turned out that all it took to begin that shift was one warm evening, a backyard full of string lights, and the courage to hand a near stranger a folded piece of paper that said, "This stays between us." Sometimes the people who seem the most closed off are simply waiting for someone patient enough to prove that their trust won't be wasted. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply stay and listen and let someone know that whatever they're carrying, they don't have to carry it by themselves anymore. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that kindness comes back around and heals a part of you that you didn't even realize was still waiting to be healed.